So let's take a look at how some of the things that we've talked about in the learning section of the class relate to addiction. And we're going to really focus on two different parts of the class so far. We're going to look at the opponent process theory, which we see here. And then we'll also look at basic classical conditioning. So we're going to examine how both of those affect behavior and cognitions and so on and craving during addiction. So the opponent process theory has this model where a reaction to something, to anything that produces, either an emotional reaction or a physiological reaction, the idea is that it creates really two reactions. So we have here on the bottom the underlying processes that we can see sort of going on. And there's going to be this A process, and that's sort of the initial reaction. But then there's this B process that tries to compensate for that and bring us back down to this even keel. So you can think of this area here, this zone here, as sort of, a zero response, right? Kind of being nice and even. And anything that goes above that is going to be sort of stimulating or arousing in some way, either positive or negative. So I'll highlight that in green here. That's the A process. And anything, and then the reaction to that deviation from this even state is the B process that kicks in to bring us back down. So we have these kind of opposite forces. One is the A process, the initial reaction to the drug, and the other one is the B process, the compensation, or you can think of it as the reaction to the reaction. Now what that looks like is shown up here in the top. And as we can see, what is felt and experienced varies dramatically between the initial experience versus after repeated experience. So in the case of drug use, here we have the initial drug effect, or after repeated drug use where there's been some amount of addiction going on. And we can see that the first time, the initial experience, there was a big A state. So there's a large reaction to the drug. So maybe the drug elevated a person's heart rate, for example. And maybe it also increased their blood pressure. And it may have sped up their thinking a little bit, right? So there were all sort of these sort of stimulating reactions. Now, initially, it comes up to here, right? There's this big movement in this direction. And then notice how it kind of comes down. Well, it comes down because the underlying B process has kicked in. And see how this goes down? Yeah. So at first we have this initial A reaction. Whoop. Big change in heart rate, blood pressure, in sort of the cognitive state of arousal. But then our body tries to compensate and we see this reduction, bringing things back to relative normal. Now, the compensation is not super strong because this is the initial drug effect. This is the first time, and the body doesn't really have a lot of experience sort of combating or compensating for this drug. And so the effect is sort of, more of a moderation as opposed to an elimination of the effect of the drug. And so we kind of reach this sort of steady state here until the drug wears off. And then it goes down, and then look what happens. Oh my gosh. There's sort of a negative down reaction that happens. Why? The B process is slower to go away and to resume back to normal than the A process. The A process kicks in very rapidly when the drug kicks in, and then whoop, goes right back down very quickly as the drug fades away. But the reaction of the B process here, this compensation for the drug, lingers a little bit. And as it lingers, then it means that you're, instead of going back to normal when the drug wears off, you're kind of in this sort of a downer sort of state if the drug had been a stimulant. And that takes a little while to come back to normal until the B process fades away before we can get back here to this sort of normal state. Now, after much experience using the drug and addiction has kicked in, notice the person's reaction is really small. So there's a large amount of tolerance. But at the same time, there's a large withdrawal effect. When the person's not on the drug, things don't feel quite right. And we can explain that as well with the A and B underlying processes. Notice the B is identical. Up, steady, and then down. The first B process is the same as the 100th B process. Does not change. What has changed is that the B process has gotten larger. And so whereas it was this big initially, it's now, whoa, this big, and takes longer to go away. And this is what causes the withdrawal when the drug is taken away. So you can see here that while the drug is in the person's system, during this little period of time, we have the A process and then the B process that tries to compensate, and we feel what's shown up here. This is what we feel up here. After many uses of the drug, here once again the drug effect, the B has now gotten much larger, minimizing the effect of the drug, creating tolerance, but also creating the potential for a large withdrawal effect because of that slow removal of the B process. And so this is a use of the opponent process theory, habituation, and sensitization to explain drug tolerance and withdrawal. However, that doesn't really explain like the other aspects of drug use, the craving really, and some of the other effects of it, the idea that we might want to use a particular drug with certain people in a particular place. This really is based on just explaining the tolerance and the withdrawal. And we know there's a lot more to drug use than those two things. Otherwise, when a person was no longer experiencing withdrawal, they should no longer have any need to use the drug or any desire to use the drug anymore. So this is, really not explaining much of drug use because drug use is not that simple. People resume smoking, for example, years after they quit. Why? Well, it is not because they're experiencing withdrawal symptoms. The withdrawal symptoms only last, a few weeks. And so resuming smoking a year or two after they quit is not explained through this. There's other things that are going on. Instead, they rely on these classical conditioning processes. And so it turns out that there are two different ways that classical conditioning can form associations. One type of association is what's called SR. S stands for stimulus, R stands for a response. In other words, when I see something, I respond to it. So it's sort of a very quick and almost kind of mindless sort of reaction. It's an automatic reaction. So what is going on is that the person, according to SR learning, is that the person might encounter the drug itself or drug-related cues, and then they engage in the response, which is going to involve drug taking. So as an example, Homer Simpson over here might automatically walk into his favorite bar when he sees it as he passes by. Now, does habit learning explain drug use? It is sort of a compulsive type of behavior, but it seems that there's really, again, more to this, more to drug use than this. SR habits may explain some of the rituals seen with drug use. By rituals, I mean the way a person might hold a cigarette, or the way that they might spin the cigarette in their hands before smoking it. Those types of drug-related rituals might be explained through habit learning. But the bigger issues in drug use may not be explained very well with stimulus response associations. The second type of association that can form in classical conditioning is called SS, stimulus-stimulus. These types of associations are a little more mindful. These refer to the way that when we see one stimulus, it can remind us of another stimulus. Notice there's no knee-jerk reaction. There's no automatic response here. What there is a reminder of, oh yeah, when I hang out with these people, I normally drink alcohol. Or when I go to this bar, I normally have a good time. Those kinds of things. So seeing a friend might remind you of how you enjoy drinking together. And so the associations are really just between different stimuli. You see a friend, reminds you of alcohol, reminds you of having fun. And so stimulus one, the first S, would be cues associated with drugs like friends, bars, those kinds of things. And then the second stimulus that gets remembered are the drug sensations, which might include pretty powerful motivations like decreased anxiety, more laughter, euphoria. And so it can explain why a person might long for a drug long after they've no longer experienced withdrawal symptoms. So a year after quitting cigarettes, they might still feel the pull of it because if they enter an environment where in the past they were able to reduce their anxiety by smoking, they might once again be reminded of that when they're anxious. And so these SS processes can lead to, unfortunately, exaggerated expectations for how good the drug or the substance is going to make us feel. And the idea is that the incentive to use the drug gets sensitized or enhanced, and it gets kind of blown out of proportion. So here's a little model that we can take a look at where the conditional stimulus, the cues, right, the people, the places, and so on, are associated perhaps with a number of things, including perhaps a drug, and then that brings to mind this heightened and exaggerated memory of how great everything was, and that can lead then to a high level of motivation. And so we see some evidence of two types of sensitized incentive. One is a psychomotor activating effect that includes strong arousal, heightened attention, and those things, a lot of movement. And the other one is the incentive motivational effects, the enhanced wanting of the drug. So one is more movement related and sort of physical, and the other one is more psychological. So here's some examples of stimulus response and stimulus-stimulus associations, because you will want to know both of these and be comfortable with both of these. Stimulus response, as a non-drug example, after an accident with a blue car, you automatically slow down when you see a blue car, even if it is far in front of you. So it's an automatic reaction. Another SR association might be if I mindlessly turn right on Lewis Road, even though I don't live in that direction anymore. These are things that we consider habits. Stimulus-stimulus associations might look more like this. A particular pipe tobacco reminds me of my grandfather, and then I smile. Or a commercial for pizza reminds me of my favorite pizza. I don't order any though because I already had dinner. In other words, I don't have to react. It's more of a memory than a habit.